Hi, this is Mr. Coates, and this is APES lecture number 47, Slowing Climate Change. We've seen some of the possible ramifications of climate change. So what can we do to slow the changing climate? Because a lot of scientists say that there's not much we can do to stop it at this point. It's going to change, but there might be a way to slow it down so we can start getting more and more prepared for some of those ramifications. One of the most important things that has happened due to increased CO2 levels is that the ocean has really been a buffer for this problem. And by buffer, I mean it's kind of resisted the main problems with CO2. And the ocean has sequestered or taken in most of the excess CO2 that's been emitted since the Industrial Revolution. Now, one of the things we have to realize is that solubility of gases in water depends on temperature. The colder the water, the more gas can be dissolved in the water. The warmer the water, the less gas can be dissolved in the water. So as the globe warms up, that means the Earth's oceans are warming up, and the oceans will start to lose their ability to absorb CO2 as time goes on. This is another positive feedback loop. Now, the other thing that's happening is that CO2 reacts in water, and we saw this back with our acid rain lab. And as more and more CO2 dissolves into the ocean, the pH starts to change in the ocean. This is a phenomenon called ocean acidification. So as the ocean's pH starts to drop, because this is starting to become harmful to those organisms that produce calcium carbonate based shells, and this acid will start dissolving their shells or start limiting the amount of shell they can produce just by because they have to fight this acid effect. So this could be a huge problem for our world's oceans as time goes on. Thankfully, the oceans have absorbed most of the CO2 that we produced and are trying to keep it in check, but it hasn't been enough to slow the actual temperature increase we've seen so far. Now, the other thing scientists think could happen is if we increase the temperature on the planet, that means we're going to increase the amount of water vapor, the amount of evaporation that happens. Now, this could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. If the water vapor does in fact condense and creates low clouds, that could actually cool the planet by reflecting sunlight back out into space. However, if the water vapor does not condense into clouds, it becomes more of a greenhouse gas situation. It also depends on what type of clouds are formed. If we're talking about low clouds like the ones down here, then that's a good thing. That really helps shade the Earth and reflect those rays back into space. However, if we're talking about high altitude cirrus clouds like these that are caused naturally but also caused by jet airplanes flying through the troposphere, then these things actually trap heat, and that could become more of a problem. So it just depends on which clouds we're talking about when it comes to the effect of clouds. Clouds are actually one of the hardest things for scientists to model, and it is one of the biggest questions when it comes to our climate models is what is the effect of clouds and what kind of clouds are going to be produced by increased warming. Another thing that can happen is that our air pollution might save us for a little while. Realize that our air pollution contains aerosols, which are tiny droplets and solid particles. These molecules can form smog, and the smog could in fact block some of the sunlight and causing a cooling effect, and then at night a warming effect would occur. But realize more SO2 in the atmosphere is not really the answer, because remember, SO2 creates a lot of acid deposition, and the more SO2 we have in the atmosphere, the more acid deposition. So this is not really the best solution. Don't count on pollution being our savior. Now, two scientists from Princeton University came up with an idea called the climate stabilization wedges. And they basically said that in order to keep CO2 from doubling by 2057, which is the current projection, 8 of these major wedges over here, or the equivalent of the CO2 that would be taken away from by those wedges, would have to be phased in by the year 2057. Some of these wedges are pretty straightforward. Increase the fuel efficiency of all the cars. Replace coal-fired plants with natural gas-fired plants. Stop all deforestation. So these things are all pretty good ideas. However, in order for this to work, they would say that 8 of these wedges, and there are 15 of them, 8 of them would have to be implemented. And you have to figure out, well, which one of these 8 are the best ones to do, and which ones are going to be the easiest ones to do. Well, you actually get your biggest bang for your buck with the energy efficiency and renewable energy wedges. 60 to 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions could be reduced by 2050, according to a 2007 study, if you were to eliminate the first few wedges at the top. But the question is, which 8 are you willing to live with? And it probably depends on what you do. It probably depends on your lifestyle. It probably depends on where you live. And trying to get everyone to agree on the top 8 would be probably pretty difficult. But these are some of the things that if climate change is happening and we want to reduce the damage from CO2, these are some of the hard choices we're going to have to make. How about CO2 sequestration? Sequestration means to take the CO2 out of the atmosphere or before it even gets in the atmosphere and put it somewhere so it never enters the atmosphere. And so there are all kinds of techno fixes out there for doing this. You can pump the CO2 back into empty reservoirs where we've taken out oil and natural gas. You can pump it into deep ocean sediments. A lot of these things are very expensive because it takes more energy to do this kind of thing. However, the cheapest thing would be to stop deforestation and plant a bunch more trees. Trees are automatic carbon sequestration organisms. And by planting more plants and more trees, this could definitely help us with carbon sequestration. Now, the other thing about sequestering carbon underground is that we could never, ever have any leaks. If you had a leak, then this would just release a whole bunch of CO2 all at once, and our CO2 problem would just be the same. And unfortunately, because of geologic processes, the chance of these underground reservoirs here ever leaking is pretty high. And that could be a problem. And there are some examples of large CO2 release in the world and how catastrophic it can be. Remember, CO2 in high enough concentrations will suffocate living things. So here's an example. This is Lake Nyos. In August of '86, there was a huge turnover in the lake. At the bottom of this lake, there was a lot of CO2 buildup, and I'm not sure why the CO2 built up at the bottom of the lake, but we had a huge turnover. So CO2 bubbled to the surface, and CO2 is heavier than air, and it stayed on the ground level. And this ended up killing all kinds of wildlife, killed over 1,000 people, kind of gave everybody a wake-up call that large releases of CO2 can be catastrophic. You put large amounts of CO2 underground near habited areas and we have some kind of major tectonic event that releases all this CO2, you could have these kind of catastrophic events. Sequestering CO2, while it sounds good, it may not be the right answer. While CO2 regulation has been slow to come because just the identification of CO2 as a pollutant has been difficult, there have been some international agreements and treaties and things like that that have been talked about. And one of the first was in 1992, the Earth Summit. It was the first time where international community got together and said that we need to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and focus on CO2 worldwide. And it was going to be the only way we could really stop climate change. Now later on in 1997, another international treaty came about called the Kyoto Protocol. And the whole idea was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, specifically CO2, worldwide, and require 38 developed countries, including the United States, to cut our emissions by an average of 5.2% lower than in 1990. However, it would not require developing countries to lower due to an earlier treaty, and it would allow international emissions trading. It would allow forested countries, if you had so much forestry that you could get some kind of break because of that sequestration effect. And it would allow penalties for violators. The problem is that the United States did not join this, neither did Canada and some other countries. The reason why we did not join this treaty is because India and China were in these developing countries that were not required to lower their CO2. And the United States, and George Bush was president at that time, he said that this would be a threat to our national security, that if we spent a lot of effort getting our CO2 nationwide down this 5.2%, where China and India didn't have to do that, that would hurt our national security and also our economy. And so we pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol and did not sign it. However, there were several cities in the United States that pledged to try and meet the Kyoto standards on their own, and many of those are in California, and they are currently working on doing that. So why is it so hard to deal with global climate change? First of all, it's global. So that means the globe has to be on board, the entire globe. And we can't even agree on who gets the right amount of food and who gets what water. And we can't agree on anything globally right now. And the chance of us ever as a globe getting on board with this, something catastrophic globally is going to happen. The effects of climate change are long-standing. Even if we do something now, you will not see any drastic cuts in CO2 and for another 120, 140 years. And most of us will not be alive by then. So why do anything is a big thing. It's like, it's not going to affect me. It's definitely going to affect your kids. It's very hard to do something that's not going to affect you and hope for the best in years where you won't even be alive. It's a long-term political issue. Like I said, most of the people affected have not even been born yet. How do the politics work out and plan for people that aren't even born yet? That's a difficult thing to do. The effects of climate change are not spread out equally. Sometimes the climate change can be a positive thing for some countries. For example, Canada could become the world's breadbasket. Currently, the United States is in the Midwest, but if these growing areas continue to migrate northward, Canada could become the breadbasket, and they could make a lot of money by selling food to other parts of the world that need it because of climate change. The other thing is that there's all kinds of economic cost and political cost, and so there's all kinds of controversy because of this, and not everybody wants to get on board. And you kind of see this here. It's all kinds of different viewpoints on climate change and how different people affect. I would say a huge majority of the American population are this girl right here who thinks that Kardashians are more important than thinking about climate change. Let's see, and then you have the severe right-wing folks, that are saying it's all made up, and then you have people that say that it's doomsday. And so once again, it all comes back to this noise factor that just takes away the importance of the issue from being in the forefront. Well, I hope that gave you some information on how we can possibly slow climate change and deal with it. Once again, probably being prepared for the effects of climate change is going to be the best solution at this point, but we really need as a world to start getting on this CO2 problem and come up with an idea and how to reduce it.